All right, today we're going to dive into something that's made huge waves online, the CES letter. Now, you've probably heard of it, but here's the twist. We're not going to get into a point-by-point debate of its claims. Nope, we're going to look at something way more interesting, its method. What makes this thing so persuasive to so many people? Well, according to the source material we're looking at, the secret sauce isn't really the evidence, it's the strategy. So let's pull back the curtain on that strategy, and we're going to start with how our source sizes it up. And boom, right out of the gate, our source lands a heavy punch. It doesn't label the CES letter as some kind of objective, scholarly paper. Not at all. It calls it a curated prosecutorial brief. Think about that for a second. That's the language of a courtroom, right? It's a lawyer for the prosecution making their case. This one phrase really sets the tone for everything we're about to explore. It's suggesting this isn't about a neutral search for truth, it's a one-sided argument built to win you over. The source is basically saying the letter's real power isn't in the facts, but in how it argues. So what's the main weapon in this rhetorical arsenal? The source points to a really powerful psychological tactic it calls information shock. The name says it all, right? It's the idea of hitting someone with a fire hose of information, just a massive, relentless, rapid-fire list of criticisms. It's just too much. You can't possibly process it all at once. And that feeling, that sense of being completely overwhelmed, can start to feel like the weight of actual evidence. It's a strategy that's all about psychological impact, not slow, careful thought. Okay, so let's get into the nuts and bolts here. How does this shock effect actually pull it off? According to the source, it's not really about any one single argument being a knockout punch. It's more of a combo move, a mix of psychological framing, super intentional pacing, and a style that is just perfectly built for the way we consume information online today. The source really unpacks this for us. First, there's the psychology. For someone inside the faith, it can feel like a deep betrayal when stories they've known their whole life are suddenly twisted into something negative. Then there's the presentation, that confident prosecutorial tone. To an outsider, that can sound really authoritative. And the pacing, oh man, it's pure internet. Short, punchy claims that just keep coming, creating that feeling of, wow, where there's this much smoke, there has to be a fire, right? It's that emotional punch that makes it go viral, makes it so shareable. And honestly, you see these tactics all over the internet, not just here. All right, let's switch gears a little and talk about the logic of the letter. The source makes a really bold claim here. It says the whole entire argument, the whole thing, is built on top of one single foundational assumption, an assumption that's never actually proven. And this slide just lays out that core conflict perfectly. On one side, you have what the source claims is the letter's hidden assumption, that if God is involved, things should be clean, simple, perfect. No mistakes, no messiness. So anytime you find a human flaw or a complicated detail, boom, that's proof it wasn't divine. But then on the other side, the source offers a totally different starting point. It says, hey, have you read the scriptures? The Bible, the Book of Mormon, they are packed with stories about messy, imperfect people in really complicated, not so tidy divine events. And here's the crucial takeaway. The source doesn't just disagree with this premise, it calls it a logical fallacy. It's basically saying the letter is assuming the very thing it's trying to prove. If you start with the rule that anything divine must be flawless, then of course, finding a flaw is going to prove your point. But that's not really an argument, is it? It's circular reasoning. The conclusion was already baked right into the starting assumption from the get-go. Okay, so moving on from the big philosophical assumption, our source gets into some really specific rhetorical tactics. This next part is all about how the framing of a fact can actually be way more powerful than the fact itself. You know, it's not just what you say, it's how you say it. The source has a name for this, a framing error, and it breaks it down into a simple 4-step recipe. Step 1, you start with a real historical fact. Totally true. For example, the fact that there are multiple versions of Joseph Smith's first vision. Step 2, you strip out all the important context. You know, things like who he was talking to or why he was telling the story at that particular time. Step 3, you present what's left in the most negative, inflammatory way possible. So differences become major contradictions. And finally, step 4, you draw a negative conclusion that the full story just doesn't support. But here's the kicker. The source argues that if you put that context back in, historians would say that having multiple accounts actually makes the event more historically reliable, not less. And here's another one for you, another tactic the source points out. It's called the kitchen sink fallacy. And you know that old saying, throwing everything in but the kitchen sink? Well, that's exactly the idea here.
It ties right back into that information shock we talked about. You just hurl every single possible issue you can find at the reader, big or small, to make it feel like the whole structure is just collapsing. And this slide just gives you a taste of what that feels like. Why a stone in a hat? Why is the King James Version in the Book of Mormon? What about steel? What about the witnesses seeing visions? Multiple first vision accounts? Polygamy? You see what's happening. The source's point is that by mixing huge, complex theological issues like polygamy right alongside smaller, technical questions, the letter creates this illusion that everything is equally damning. It just throws it all into one big pile without any sense of scale or proportion. And that, the source argues, is a rhetorical move, not a fair analysis.
Okay, so after hearing all of these critiques, framing errors, the kitchen sink, information shock, you're probably thinking the source just throws the entire CES letter in the trash, right? But hold on, because this is where the analysis takes a really interesting and much more nuanced turn. Yeah, the source is actually super clear on this point. It draws a really sharp line in the sand. On one side, you have what it calls flawed rhetorical arguments. But on the other, it acknowledges that the letter brings up some genuinely legitimate, tough historical questions. And it's quick to point out, these questions didn't just pop into existence with a CES letter. They've been around and they deserve real, thoughtful, contextualized answers. So what kind of questions make the legitimate list? Well, the source highlights a few big ones. Things like the need to be more upfront and transparent about the translation process, with the seer stones, the incredibly messy and complicated history of early polygamy, the genuine scholarly debates surrounding the Book of Abraham. The source's point here is absolutely crucial. Facing these tough questions head-on is what good, honest history is all about. And that's a world away from just using them as weapons in a one-sided legal case. All right, let's bring this all home. We've looked at the tactics, we've looked at the legitimate questions, so what's the final takeaway from our source? It really boils everything we've talked about down to one single central idea. It all comes down to the method. It's about how you decide to look at the evidence. And this final comparison just lays it all out so clearly. In one corner, you have the approach the source pins on the CES letter, hitting you with information shock using framing errors, starting from purely secular assumptions and leaving out key context. But in the other corner, you have the proposed antidote. This approach requires discipline, digging into the historical context, asking those big questions about how we even know what we know, and importantly, looking at the evidence through a framework that leaves room for the possibility of revelation. The source is saying these are two totally different toolkits for examining the exact same set of historical facts. So what's the final verdict from our source? It's pretty blunt, actually. It concludes that the letter's arguments feel so powerful, mainly because they're built on a foundation of removed context and clever framing. The argument is that once you put all that context back, once you see the bigger picture, the accusations just lose their punch. The whole thing kind of deflates. And that brings us to the final, really thought-provoking question at the heart of all this. According to this analysis, maybe the real debate isn't even about the historical evidence itself. Maybe it's about the framework, the lens we choose to look at that evidence through. So I'll leave you with this. What do you think matters more in the end? The raw data? Or the story we decide to tell about that data?